Sherlock Bones and the Mystery of the Crimson Feather. A hushed panic had come over the animals at the old house. Leopold the parrot had disappeared, gone, vanished overnight from his cage. Mrs. Nan had made the discovery during the morning as she carried out her regular patrol around the rooms of the house, making sure everything was in order and hunting for any discarded biscuits or sweet treats under the tables to nibble on. She had followed her usual route past the kitchen, followed by a quick glance around Mr. Scratton's study, never any biscuits in there, through to the games room and sitting room, then a quick check in the hallway, and finally into the parlour, where she was guaranteed to find at the very least a pink wafer, or, if she was lucky, an entire chocolate digestive. On the morning in question, she entered the room, nose to the ground, ready to sniff out edible treasure, and without looking up, called a customary greeting to Leopold the parrot, who'd respond by saying something rude or going to the toilet in his cage with a purposefully audible plop. "Morning, Leopold," she said, to which she was greeted with an uncharacteristic silence. "Well, I'd have expected something better than that," she continued. "What's up with you? Cat got your tongue?" and chuckled to herself at her witty remark. Still no sound came from the birdcage. She looked up from underneath the small side table she'd been searching under to discover, to her horror, that Leopold's cage door was open, but the parrot was nowhere to be seen. "Perhaps he's hiding and waiting to pounce on me," she thought to herself, as one of his favourite tricks was to hide behind the curtains and then flap out as his unsuspecting victim walked past, often accompanied by loud squawking. But today there was nothing. Mrs. Nan had an uneasy feeling and went to find the other animals to see if any of them could shed light on this mystery. As the sun was out, she knew where to find them and dashed off to the walled garden, where, sure enough, the cats were securing their spot on the paving slabs where the sun was starting to warm them up nicely. And Pompey, a large and very lazy tabby cat, was stretched out across the biggest one. He'd been adopted by the family to chase mice from the barn, but couldn't even be bothered to chase his own tail, and so had taken up the new position of chief purrer, cuddler, and lap snuggler, which very much suited the animal-loving Scratton children. However, his position of furniture scratcher and chief throw-upper didn't sit too well with Mr. and Mrs. Scratton. Binks the dog was up to his usual antics in the vegetable and flower beds, digging them up. And as Mrs. Nan approached, he looked up, sneezed the dirt out of his nose, and called out cheerily, "Morning, Ma! Find anything nice under the tables today?" When she didn't respond immediately, he and all the other animals knew something was up. Plus, she was doing her serious walk, which meant either Binks was in trouble or someone else was. The little dog was in quite the panic as she reached the garden, as although Leopold could be most infuriating at times, well, most of the time in fact, she couldn't bear the thought that something untoward could have happened to him. After pacing back and forth for a time, she gathered her thoughts and took a deep breath in preparation for the bad news she was about to impart. The other animals, who by now had grouped together in curiosity as to what on earth the matter could be, came closer to her, and Mrs. Kittles was the first to speak. "Oh, Mrs. Nan, whatever's the matter?" she asked, the concern evident in her voice. "He's gone! Disappeared! Nowhere to be seen!" the small dog exclaimed. Mrs. Kittles placed a protective paw on Mrs. Nan's shoulder and said gently, "Who's disappeared, Mrs. Nan? Who?" And Mrs. Nan recounted her visit to the parlour and her discovery that Leopold's cage was empty. "I looked everywhere, all over the house, but he's gone," she concluded with a sigh. The other animals sat for a while in subdued silence, taking in the news, when finally Binks spoke. "We need an investigation," he said solemnly, "and I know exactly who to call. Leave it to me," and off he ran. A while later, Binks returned, and he was not alone. Accompanying him was another dog, a very large dog, its nose almost glued to the ground as it sniffed its way across the lawn. Mrs. Nan recognised the dog as Sherlock, the bloodhound who lived at the neighbouring farm, and wondered to herself how he was going to be able to help their current conundrum. But such was the desperateness of the situation, she was prepared to try anything. The bloodhound introduced himself to the assembled companions. "The name's Bones, Sherlock Bones, and I hear you have a mystery that requires my investigative skills," he went on. "I need to be taken to the scene of the crime." And so the animals, led by Mrs. Nan, headed back to the house, closely followed by the bloodhound, who sniffed his way along behind them. The house was quiet when they arrived, and the front door was open. The sound of the cook's off-key singing drifted out of the kitchen, along with a tantalising smell of apple pie. This did not distract Sherlock Bones, however, as he was intent on finding clues, and once the group were all gathered inside the parlour, he began his investigation. "Now," he said to the assembled companions, "I must examine this room thoroughly and methodically in order to sniff out the clues and get to the bottom of this mystery." Well, as we all know, dogs and sniffing and bottoms is a well-known fact of life, so Mrs. Nan and Binks were not put off at all by this statement, but the cats were appalled. Twinkle and Tabitha shot back out into the hallway, and as Pompey started to back slowly out of the room, Mrs. Kittles announced to the dogs that she would absolutely not stay a moment longer and risk having her bottom sniffed. And with this, she flounced defiantly out of the room with her nose in the air. Mrs. Nan found the cats' indignation most amusing and quite hypocritical, as they were more than happy to wash their bottoms in full view of everyone, which was far more offensive in her opinion. "Please do continue, Mr. Bones," she said, ignoring the cat's rude departure, and the bloodhound began to scour the room. It wasn't long before his keen nose led him to a clue that Mrs. Nan hadn't noticed before. By the window in the corner near Leopold's cage, and just visible beneath the curtains, was a crimson-coloured feather. Sherlock Bones retrieved the feather from its hiding place and placed it on the small side table for examination. It was large and straight and a very deep shade of red, with a strange-looking metal beak at the end. "This object near the scene of the crime will lead us to the perpetrator," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. "Find who or what this belongs to, and we have our culprit." He pondered the feather for a moment, gave it a quick sniff, and then requested the other two dogs accompany him to the walled garden, where the investigation would continue. Binks looked thoroughly confused as he trailed behind his mother, dutifully following Sherlock Bones out of the house. "What's a purple traitor?" he whispered. "I've no idea," she murmured in response, "but I think we're about to find out." Back at the walled garden, the investigation continued, as Sherlock Bones began by examining the birds who lived with the family, and who, in his opinion, had both motive and opportunity to be rid of Leopold the parrot and take his place in the house. The feather had once belonged to a bird, so it was elementary that he should start with them. Looking at the birds lined up before him, it was clear that the feather did not match theirs. Prince Parvo the peacock had feathers of blue, green and gold, and his plumage was very elaborate, so not a match for the crimson feather. Mr. Bilham the crow was the next suspect, and with his shiny black feathers was not a match either. Horatio the magpie was the final bird to come under the watchful nose of Sherlock Bones. As everyone knows, magpies have black and white feathers, and, as if this wasn't evidence enough, Horatio was aghast at the suggestion that he would be seen in such a vulgar and unbecoming colour, and flew away in a huff. Said Sherlock. "The trail is running cold. We must return to the scene of the crime to resume our search for clues." And the three dogs turned tail and once more made their way toward the Scratton family home. As they approached the house, Mrs. Nan thought she could hear Leopold, but surely not. You can imagine her shock and surprise when she walked into the parlour, and who should be sat on top of his cage, preening his feathers, but Leopold. But what the... Leopold! I thought you had been bird-napped, she cried as she skipped over to where the parrot was perched. It turned out that Leopold had spent the day being pampered, having his feathers groomed and his claws clipped, and was now back home where he belonged, letting everybody know how wonderful he looked by squawking at the top of his voice. "Who's a pretty boy? Me! Me! Ha 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 ha!" For a fleeting moment, Mrs. Nan wasn't sure how pleased she really was to see the parrot back in the parlour, being as noisy and obnoxious as usual, but she had secretly missed him and was relieved he was safe and sound. "Clearly, there has been no crime committed here," said Sherlock sagely. "This is a case of lost property, and this feather must belong to somebody, but who?" At that moment, Dorothy came into the room, and noticing the feather on the side table where Sherlock had placed it after discovering it under the curtains, called out to her siblings. "Peggy, Muriel, Geoffrey, Humphrey, Barbara, come to the parlour, quickly now!" One by one, the Scratton children came into the room to see what all the fuss was about. "Look, everyone," said Dorothy triumphantly. "I found my lost quill pen. I've been hunting everywhere for it, and now it's back." "And," added Peggy, "dear old Sherlock's here for a visit. Do you think he found your pen?" The children laughed heartily as they imagined how Sherlock might have led an investigation into the mystery of the pen's disappearance. "Perhaps that should be the first story in our new magazine," suggested Humphrey, and the others agreed that they must write stories about all their animals in the publication they were planning. "We'll call it The Priory Times," said Dorothy, "and the first story shall be written with this lovely crimson feather pen," and she held it up triumphantly. The siblings eventually left the room, chatting excitedly about their new venture, and went on the hunt for ink, paper, pencils and paints. The dogs remained in the parlour, and Sherlock was the first to break the silence. "I believe my work here is done," he said. "The object and the owner have been reunited, and I will now bid you a farewell." And without further ado, he strolled out of the parlour, leaving Mrs. Nan and Binks to muse over what had just occurred. "A pen made from a feather?" said Binks. "How strange!" "And stories about us?" laughed Mrs. Nan. "That will never catch on." And chuckling away to themselves, mother and son trotted out of the house and headed across the lawn to the walled garden to meet up with the other animals, where they would soon be regaling the story of Leopold's return and the feather that turned out to be a storytelling pen. In the distance, they spotted the familiar figure of Sherlock Bones, ambling home across the park, nose to the ground, and no doubt on the trail of another mystery. We hope you've enjoyed our first series of stories inspired by our collections and the Scratton family who lived here in Prittlewell Priory over 100 years ago. We'd really love to receive your stories, so keep an eye on our social media pages and look out for object images we'll be posting to inspire your creative writing. And we'll be back very soon with more timeless tales.